Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Melissa, and I am the programming librarian at the Oakland Public Library. We're so glad to have you here tonight for our unprecedented virtual programs that we've got going on right now. Tonight we have Kevin Korst presenting. He is our local history coordinator who has done tons of research on Oakland and the surrounding suburbs and has done fascinating presentations on cemeteries around Chicago, which he's going to talk to you about tonight. So without further ado, I think I've covered everything. So I will let you go ahead and take it away, Kevin. Just takes a second, he'll share a screen and then get started.
All right. Yep. Thank you guys so much for coming out tonight. Let me switch over here. So in the meantime, I'm going to ramble a little bit while I get us ready to go here. So as Melissa said, my name is Kevin Korst. I am the local history manager at the Oakland Public Library. I've been in this position since 2008, amazingly enough. And we do exhibits and programming and digital collections and research, all sorts of different things. And so generally we focus on the Oakland area. But a number of years ago, a coworker of mine was like, have you ever thought about doing programming based on local cemeteries? And I said, I actually hadn't. I hadn't thought about that. But it's something that always intrigued me, being interested in local history and genealogy and how they're all interconnected and interrelated, and cemeteries are a great place to find that information. And so I started going down this rabbit hole, and what I very quickly found out is that the Chicagoland area is full of dozens and dozens and dozens of cemeteries, and they are everywhere, and they're huge and they're small, and some are tucked away and some aren't, but they are all over the place. And so what I decided to do is focus on some of the ones that I found most interesting. Can you guys see my screen now?
Yes, I can see it.
Perfect. Thank you. So I decided to focus on some of the ones that I found most interesting, where there were some of the people and places and events that kind of intrigued me the most. So what I want to do tonight is take you on kind of a journey through these different cemeteries, ranging from the north side to the south side of Chicago, and tell you about some of the things that sort of piqued my attention, some of the amazing stories that these places have to tell, and how they are just full of just this incredible history that is constantly surrounding us. And I'm excited to share that with you tonight. So without further ado, let's get going. All right. So early in Chicago's history, small graveyards were seen in many places, right? They were near forts, rivers, lakefronts, homes, kind of all over the place. Well, in 1843, a city cemetery, like a big centralized location, was established in what is now present-day Lincoln Park. Of course, due to the proximity to the lake, which was then and still is the city's primary water supply, and overcrowding, bodies were moved to Graceland and Rose Hill cemeteries in the 1860s and 70s. Well, even with that, today, roughly 13,000 people remain buried under Lincoln Park, which is incredible. It is still a cemetery. And the image on the left there with the overlay shows kind of where City Cemetery was, Chicago Cemetery, on present day Lincoln Park. And that's not something I ever realized when I was up in the city. And I'm willing to bet that most people, whether they're jogging or going to work or attending some event in Lincoln Park, do not realize how many people are still buried there. And on the right, you can see the Couch Mausoleum. That was Ira Couch. That is who is interred there. And that's one of the very few visible reminders that Lincoln Park was and is still a cemetery. Of course, as time went on, more organized cemeteries began popping up in different parts of the city, both inside and outside of the borders. So the first place I want to start tonight is Bachelor's Grove. And some of you maybe have been brave enough to venture there. And the reason I'm starting here is it's such a cool mix of history and mythology and urban legend that all kind of intertwine into one. And there's some really cool stories to tell. So the first recorded burial here was Eliza Scott in 1844. And it's probably named after a local family, the Batchelor family, who were among a number of German immigrants from Vermont and New York and Connecticut that settled in that area. There is a legend that the name for the cemetery comes from 4 single men who were buried there. That's probably not true. It was probably named after a family, but urban legends are fun, and I did want to share that. So when I visited the cemetery several years ago, this is what the path leading into the cemetery looked like. Now, for decades, it was considered by those living nearby to be an area for relaxation. Families would picnic there. People would come to swim and fish in a small kind of little pond that's near there. But the last known burials were Laura McGee in 1965, and then Robert E. Shields, who had his ashes spread there in 1989. However, really, since the 1950s, burials are extremely rare there. So there is very little left of the cemetery. If you're just kind of walking by it and you just sort of take a quick glance over, you probably we wouldn't even know what it was. And that's in part because quite a bit of vandalism, unfortunately, began in the 1960s. There were stones knocked down, they were stolen or spray painted, graves were dug up, all sorts of unfortunate damage was done. And there was a fence installed in the 1970s that clearly has not kept anyone out. And it is a shame how it has declined so quickly over the last 4 or 5 decades. Now, an estimated 150 to 200 people were buried here at one time. Nobody's really sure how many are left because many were reinterred in different area cemeteries. But it really has become a forgotten location, and only a few dedicated individuals are actively working to preserve its heritage. There are about a dozen or so gravestones left. Many are thrown about and don't sit on their original locations, but research has been done to determine where the graves may have originally been located at. Now, I'm guessing some of you have seen this photograph before. We can't talk about Bachelor's Grove without discussing the supernatural. They just go hand in hand together. And it has become known as one of the most haunted places in America. Stories began cropping up in the 1950s and 1960s, and they seem to really peak in the 70s and 80s. Some of the ones you come across are reports of phantom cars, ghostly horses and plows, a farmhouse that would appear and disappear, spirits, all sorts of different things like that. So this particular photo was taken around 1991 and appeared in the Chicago Sun-Times. Now, it supposedly captures a spirit that only showed up after the film was developed. So as I said, this is a very well-known photo, and people have really kind of taken to it. So this spirit that supposedly shows up in the photograph has been nicknamed the White Lady, the Madonna of Bachelor's Grove, and Mrs. Rogers. So people really seem to like it, and it's a very interesting photograph, to say the least. So this is the same stone as it looked on the day I went to the cemetery. For better or worse, I did not capture a ghost, although that would have been pretty cool. There have been well over 100 reports of paranormal activity through the years that have happened at Bachelor's Grove. And although there is very much a large group of believers, there is also, of course, skeptics, right? There's 2 sides to every story. And it was interesting. The day I went to the cemetery, I was walking in to take photographs and do some research. And there was a gentleman standing right by the front of the gate. And he walked up to me and asked me what I was doing. And I told him I'm doing research for this program. And he went on to talk about all of these paranormal experiences that he had at the cemetery. And he was very excited about it. And he shared it with me, and it was fun. And then I walk inside the cemetery, and there's another individual there, and he's kind of standing near the center. And he asked me what I was doing, and I told him again. And he's like, "Did you talk to that guy outside?" And I was like, "Yeah, I talked to him just a few minutes ago." And he's like, "Yeah, that guy's full of crap. Nothing happens here." So it's one of those things where you have vocal people on both sides, but regardless of what you believe or don't believe, Bachelor's Grove is it's a cool place, and I love it when you do get that mix of history and supernatural mythology. It makes for really interesting stories. So the next stop on my tour is Mount Olivet. Now, Mount Olivet was founded in 1885, and it comprises 93 acres and about 142,000 graves. So it is a big cemetery. And this was among the first Catholic cemeteries on the south side of the city. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the story of Mrs. O'Leary's cow, right? I've talked to people over the years who actually remember learning this in school as children, as to this is how the fire started. And we now know that's not true, but it's interesting that it does come up that way. So outside of Al Capone and Michael Jordan, this is probably one of the things that Chicago is known best for. And as for O'Leary, she was born around 1827 and lived at 137 DeKoven Street when the fire began near her barn in October of 1871. So shortly after the fire, Michael Ahern, who was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune at the time, printed a story about a cow who kicked over a lantern, and voila, the legend was born, just like that. So illustrations soon appeared featuring Mrs. O'Leary and her now infamous, famous cow. And in 1893, Ahern admitted he'd made the story up to basically generate interest for the paper. But few people seem to really notice or care after he made that admission. Now, O'Leary, being an Irish immigrant and a woman, made her an extremely easy target at the time, and she was in the public eye for the rest of her life, which is one of those things you don't think about, but she had quite a difficult time afterwards, just because forever her and her cow were associated with this terrible event. So she passed away from pneumonia in 1895, and the Chicago City Council, being the good people that they are, exonerated her in 1997. So it was about 100 years too late, but they did, mercifully let her off the hook for starting the fire. So this grave is for James Bell, and forgive the image quality. I actually wasn't able to find this grave in the cemetery, so I have these images from online, but it's a good example too of even when you know where somebody's at in a cemetery and you have their name and everything, you can't necessarily find their grave. Sometimes it's really difficult to do so, and in this case I just couldn't. But he was a fascinating guy to research. He was a Medal of Honor winner during the Great Sioux War in the 19th century. And he immigrated to the United States from Ireland in 1866, and he enlisted in the Army just 4 years later in 1870. Now, he was part of a column of soldiers who arrived at Little Bighorn 2 days after the battle, and he helped find the remains of Custer and his men. So along with 2 other soldiers, he volunteered to deliver news of the defeat to units that were stationed further east, right? And now I was reading this and I was like, oh, wow, this is a pretty amazing story. And then I read that he won a Medal of Honor for this. And I'm like, oh, okay, he won a Medal of Honor for delivering a message. That's kind of interesting. And as I dug deeper and more of the details came out, it gives you a better idea of why he had won this medal. So he had to travel on horseback for 3 days through 100 miles of territory occupied by about 2,000 Sioux warriors. Now, he hid during the day and rode at night, but was a pretty brave and daring man. And he passed away in 1901 at the age of 55. But this is a cool example about how when you find somebody, buried somewhere and you're kind of interested in their story a little bit and you do some digging, this incredible wealth of information comes out. And it was so fascinating to learn about this gentleman and how he had won the Medal of Honor for his actions in the 1870s. So Al Capone, this is everyone's favorite gangster, I guess, if we have a favorite gangster, but most of us know the story of Al Capone. How can we not be from in and around Chicago? And he was born in 1899 in New York. He left school at the age of 14 after being expelled. And I don't know if the story is 100% true, but I'll tell it to you anyway. Supposedly, the reason he was expelled from school was because he hit a teacher in the face. And I don't know if that's true or not, but he wasn't a model adult, so it wouldn't surprise me if he wasn't a model child either. So it could very well be true. Of course, we're all familiar with when he moved to Chicago, he became a powerful mob boss. And then in 1931, he was convicted of tax evasion. Now, he spent the rest of his life in prison, and he was very ill from syphilis. And this is the part of his life that's not as well known. People don't tend to focus on that. But when he died, his syphilis was so bad that he had the mental capacity of a child, effectively. Like, he would rave about communists, foreigners. He constantly thought Bugs Moran was coming after him. So he had a pretty terrible last decade and a half of his life. And that's not something we often hear or think about. But he was originally buried in Mount Olivet. But due to grave desecration in 1950, all three bodies were moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery. And you can see in the stone on the left-hand side there, the images that were on the stone at one time are gone. They were ripped off. And the stone actually has been pushed over on several occasions too. But as with many things, a legend has developed around this site and Mount Olivet. When I was taking this photograph, there was a gentleman walking on the trail behind kind of where the stone is. And he asked me what I was doing. I said, I'm doing research. And he promptly told me that Al Capone was actually still buried there, that the cemetery just pretended to move the body to throw people off. And I don't think that's true, but it's just, it's amazing how fast stories and legends pop up around things like this. And he was excited to tell me that. So it's not only the people, but the stones themselves that are interesting, right? When you're in cemeteries, especially older ones that are more than a century or so older, grave imagery is everywhere, and each tells a different and unique story. So in this instance, you can see a sheaf of wheat is kind of running across near the top of the stone underneath the images on the grave. And these are sometimes seen on the grave of older persons. They can represent long life. Here, it actually is on the grave of two children. So it most likely means immortality or resurrection. And it's these little clues like this when you're looking at these stones that open up the past to us and give us details about who these people were, what kind of lives they led, et cetera, things like that. Now, you can just see at the top of this stone, there's a faded image of a lamb. This does appear on children's graves, but occasionally on adults as well. And this is on an adult grave in this particular instance, and it can represent purity or innocence. And it's generally recognized as a Christian image, but can be traced back as far as ancient Egyptian culture as well. So it's been with humanity for quite a long time. And this next example is a little more self-explanatory. It's the image of a running soldier. He was killed in World War I. And it's interesting because when I was doing some research on like what does imagery of soldiers mean, what I found is that sometimes depending on how the soldier is presented, it can tell us about how they died. So in this particular instance, the soldier is pictured in a running motion, and that's probably because he died of wounds suffered in battle. So it's just incredible how there's like these deep layers of meaning to these images and these stones and these graves, and they can tell us so much about these people without, with just being in front of the grave itself, without having to look any further. So after Mount Olivet, I headed to Holy Sepulchre, and some of you may know this, but Holy Sepulchre, before it was a cemetery, was a racetrack, was a horse racing track, which closed in 1905. And then during World War I, it was actually used for military purposes, I believe. But the cemetery itself opened in 1923 when Mount Olivet's space began to diminish. This was one of the first cemeteries to guarantee future care with purchase of a grave, which is kind of interesting. Like we sort of take that for granted now, like, oh yeah, I'm buying a grave in the cemetery and it'll be taken care of forever. And that was not always the case. That's kind of a recent development. But there's some interesting but probably little known people buried here that I want to talk about. So Chicago has a number of famous mayors, but most people have probably not heard the name Frank Korst. Now, he has the distinction of serving as mayor of Chicago for only 32 days. And it happened after Mayor Anton Cermak was assassinated in 1933. So Korst was selected as acting mayor, and he was appointed by party bosses basically because he wasn't threatening, right? They could just sort of plop him in there and he would keep the seat warm, if you will, until things could be figured out. Well, he did not like this. There wasn't any power in acting mayor. There was nothing. He was just sitting there. And so he very quickly became frustrated and he wanted out. And I came across the story, which I'll relay to you. And this is another one where it's like, I think this is true, but kind of take it with a grain of salt at the same time. So the city council was getting together to prepare to select a new mayor to replace Korst as acting mayor. And Korst found out that 5 of the aldermen had driven down to Hot Springs, Arkansas for vacation. And he was so worried that he might be stuck in office that he drove down there, got the 5 aldermen, brought him back to Chicago so they could vote him out of office. And it's amazing. It's a great story. It's like, how often does a politician do that? Not very. But it's just incredible how he found himself in this completely useless position and he was just chafing to get out. And unfortunately, he died the following year at the age of 59. So I don't know if the stress of that month in office did it to him. I can't imagine it helped any, though. So moving on to a slightly better known mayor, this is the grave, of course, of Richard J. Daley. He was very much a larger than life figure. He was born in Bridgeport in 1902 and he was elected mayor in 1955. One of my favorite stories that I read about Daley was that his license plate at one time was 125179. And supposedly this was a reference to how many votes he won his first election by. So he did not want anybody to forget it. He was a very controversial man, to put it lightly. Some of the positive things he did, he was instrumental in the construction of O'Hare, the Sears Tower, McCormick Place, the UIC campus. He was involved in all that. He did a lot of promoting of the middle class. On the flip side of the coin, he is believed by some historians to have helped rig the vote for Kennedy in the 60 election. His handling of the 68 Democratic Convention caused an outcry and has been assessed by historians ever since then. And there were innumerable charges of corruption while he was in office. So he kind of has this complicated legacy, to say the least. But he died of a heart attack in 1976 while he was at the doctor's office, which is something that I did not realize until I was doing research for this program. That's pretty wild. But he was Chicago's longest serving mayor until, of course, he was surpassed by his son. And his grave is near the entrance in Holy Sepulchre. It's pretty easy to find. It is quite impressive to look at in person. So when we think of Chicago gangsters, we think, of course, Al Capone and Bugs Moran, but there were dozens of other Prohibition-era criminals who are fascinating to learn about, right? So this is the grave for Frank McErlin, and he is credited with introducing the Thompson submachine gun into the Chicago underworld. So anytime you've seen a gangster film with a Tommy gun, I guess we can thank this gentleman because he apparently did that. He was also known for having a pistol in his pocket and wrapping a rosary around it, which maybe tells you some interesting things about him. And he was also possibly one of the shooters at the St. Valentine's Day massacre. That's one of those things you kind of have to take for a grain of salt too. That's such a well-known event. It seems like everybody who ever committed a crime is associated with the St. Valentine's Day massacre, but he may have been. We don't know for sure. And there are many wild stories connected to him. He was known to show up to at least one court appearance completely intoxicated, along with his guard, who was also intoxicated. And he was considered so off the handle that he legitimately frightened other gangsters because he was that unpredictable. So by 1931, years of drinking Prohibition booze had reduced his mental state. And for those of you who don't know, alcohol during Prohibition wasn't really alcohol. It could have things like radiator fluid or kerosene or other toxic chemicals in it. So it wasn't the safest thing to drink, should we say that? So one time, Frank was caught firing his shotgun at imaginary foes on South Shore Drive. You can imagine that did not go over terribly well. And he eventually became so unstable that he was effectively forced into retirement by his fellow gangsters. So he went to a houseboat in Beardstown, Illinois. He contracted pneumonia in 1932, and up until the last minutes of his life, he was convinced that that rival gangsters were coming to get him. That's a common theme. It seems like being a gangster in Prohibition-era Chicago came with a lot of baggage, should we say. So he passed away shortly after he contracted pneumonia. So moving away from gangsters and politicians for a minute to somebody a bit more pious, this grave is for Mary Alice Quinn. Now, she was born in 1920 and suffered with a chronic heart condition. She spent much of her time in bed praying and passed away in 1935 at the age of 14. So after her burial, some people in the area where she lived reported seeing an apparition of a young girl, and several claimed that they were cured of their afflictions. Now, visitors began to seek out her grave, which was unmarked at the time, and leave small gifts for her. And for a while, actually, her mother lectured at schools during the 1930s and 1940s and would distribute like small relics to the classes, such as pieces of her clothing. Now, today she is known as Chicago's miracle child. And as you can see, people still leave gifts for her. There's even some reports in recent years that people will smell roses near the grave, even when there are none present. And it is just kind of amazing. When I was walking around the cemetery looking for her stone, I was going through the section where she was, and then I turned and I saw all these things left in front of the grave, and I was like, oh wow, I bet you that's hers. And sure enough, it was. And it's kind of amazing that her legacy continues on even in the 21st century. So my next stop after Holy Sepulchre was Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel opened in 1901, and it's about 214 acres in size. There's about 226,000 people buried there. It's pretty amazing. It's a big cemetery. And there are over 400 individual family mausoleums. So like when you see those big stone structures, there's over 400 of those just in this cemetery alone, which is the most in Illinois, I believe. So I mentioned earlier that Al Capone had been moved from Mount Olivet, right? Well, this is this current grave. It's very easy to find. It's right off the main driving path, and it also has this very cool like Art Deco feel to it. So it's a neat stone to look at in person if you're ever in the cemetery. So despite being moved away because of his family's fears, the grave marker even here, unfortunately, has been vandalized. But if you can see in the picture, and I swear I did not put these there, somebody had left, the day I went, somebody had left a half-smoked cigar and an empty bottle of beer for him. And this must be a pretty common practice, because if you go online and you search for pictures of his grave, you will find a bunch of these. It's kind of incredible that people are paying, I guess, tribute to him even all these years later. And I took this next picture because I wanted to show you how often his grave is visited. When I went, the cemetery was very green, except the whole space in front of his grave was dead. And I'm sure it's because so many people come to visit his stone. And even 60 years later, I doubt that Capone could have predicted the extent of his legacy and how often people are still willing to sort of seek him out and seek out his burial place. It's pretty amazing. But as an aside, when I was doing research on Mount Carmel, I came across this comment online because there's a lot of gangsters, for lack of a better term, buried in the cemetery. And somebody said that they were laughing because these people who had spent their lives trying to kill each other now have to spend eternity with each other, which I thought was pretty clever, and I hadn't thought about it that way. So this is the grave of Giulia Bucola Petta. She is known as the Italian Bride, and she died in 1921 at the age of 29 while giving birth. So she was buried in her wedding dress, and a picture of her was put on the grave. And this was a fairly common custom at the time. It was brought over from Italy. But soon after the burial, her mother claimed to have had dreams where Giulia was telling her that she was still alive. So the dreams continued to haunt Giulia's mother, and about 7 years later, she finally secured permission to exhume her body. Now, the wooden coffin she was buried in had disintegrated, but Giulia herself was in remarkably good shape. And her mother took a picture of her and had it put on the grave where it remains. And you can see on the right there is a picture of her taken after the body was exhumed. So you have this picture of her in life, and then below that in death. Which it's kind of incredible to look at. But there's still quite a bit of controversy over why she was preserved so well. Her mother said that she believed she was incorruptible, right? Like spiritually, that the body had been preserved. Some claim the soil in the area makes a difference. Others point to improved embalming methods at the time. But regardless, when you look at this stone, when you're in the cemetery and you're standing in front of it, it is very striking. You have the statue of this woman in a wedding dress and these two different images, and there's this pretty incredible story attached to it. So it's something I wanted to share. And it is, if you're ever in the cemetery, it's very cool to look at in person. So located near the middle of Mount Carmel is the Bishop's Mausoleum. It's not hard to miss, as you can imagine. It's a huge structure, and it was constructed between 1905 and 1912, and it was designed by an architect named William J. Brinkman. Now, at the top, you can see a statue of Gabriel. He's blowing his trumpet, and the Latin phrase across the door there means they will resurrect. So there are 7 archbishops, bishops and auxiliary bishops interred here, including Joseph Cardinal Bernardine, who was interred here, buried here in 1996. All right, we're on to our next stop. So these last 2 cemeteries I want to talk about, I think are the most impressive to me personally. The first is Rose Hill, which opened in 1859. Now, the main gate, which you can see in the picture there, is constructed of Joliet limestone, is on the National Register of Historic Places. There's a legend that states the name was actually the result of a clerk's error, and it was supposed to be called Rose, R-O-E' Hill, but instead was marked as Rose Hill. But I'm not sure if that's true or not. It's just an interesting legend that has developed around the name of the cemetery. So this cemetery is massive. It is 350 acres in size. It is really incredible. It's about 7 blocks long. And when you're inside the cemetery, you almost lose a sense that you're in the middle of a city of millions of people. It's just this big chunk of land. So when it was founded, it was actually 5 miles outside of Chicago, but has since been kind of consumed by it. And there it contains the graves of soldiers from every American war, including the Revolution. When the day I went, they actually told me, the person I talked to said I was not allowed to take pictures. So I was able to thankfully find images online to go along with my research. And most places won't tell you that, but it depends if you're doing genealogy research, or if you're going to visit these places just to kind of explore and learn more about the history. You may find some people aren't terribly happy about that. It just depends on who you talk to at the cemetery and what day you go on. But thankfully, I was able to find what I needed for this presentation. One thing I wanted to point out in Rose Hill is the sheer amount and variety of gravestones, right? It's really astounding. Like, we don't often think of cemeteries as a place of these where there's so much artistic expression, right? But you can see these 4 examples I found. There's a small railroad car. There's a couch, which is really incredible on the bottom right there. There's a deer, and then the dog. And it's amazing, especially if you're walking around older cemeteries. They're just filled with these incredible sculptures and monuments. And it really is amazing to take a few minutes and just kind of look around and appreciate it for what they are, which is works of art. So some of you may know the Oscar Mayer song, right? Or maybe singing it in your head right now. This grave is Oscar Mayer, and he was born in Germany in 1859 and came to America in 1873. So he later moved to Chicago, where he started a butcher shop. And his business grew really quickly because the company did innovative things, like they would sponsor polka bands around the city, which was unique at the time. They helped sponsor the German exhibit at the 1893 World's Fair. They were really pushing advertising, which isn't something that a lot of companies did at that time. So for instance, they were the first to promote themselves in a newspaper, the first meat company. And of course, things like the Wienermobile came in 1936 and the Wiener Whistle in 1951, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And he died in 1955 at the age of 96. So if he ate a lot of hot dogs, it did not seem to bother him very much. He lived a long time. This grave is Ignaz Schwinn, and if anybody had a Schwinn bicycle growing up, you can thank this man. He was born in Germany in 1860 and immigrated to the United States in 1891. Now, he founded his company just as a bicycle craze was hitting the nation, and at one point there were around 30 bicycle factories in Chicago alone, and they were producing thousands of bikes a day. This is how much of it was everywhere, right? In the culture, it was like omnipresent across the United States. So outside of bicycles, Schwinn loved to develop new technology and actually built 12 experimental automobiles during his lifetime. And by the time he passed away in 1948, Schwinn had secured over 40 patents. He was a pretty amazing guy. And I have at the bottom right there, you can see the picture of Humphrey Bogart riding a Schwinn bicycle. And it kind of struck me. I thought it was funny because we often think of like celebrities shilling products as a more recent phenomenon, but no, Humphrey Bogart was more than happy to shill a Schwinn bicycle and get a check for it a long time ago. So it's been something that's been going on for quite a long time. This next monument is really quite something. This is Frances Pierce and her infant daughter. Now, Frances died during childbirth either in 1854 or 1864, somewhere in there, and her daughter passed away about 4 months later. Little else is known about them, but this is considered by many people to be one of the best and most beautiful monuments in Chicago at all, specifically cemetery monuments. There are many visitors to the cemetery over the course of the year just to visit this particular statue. And like many of the more popular monuments or grave sites, there are all sorts of stories connected to this one. People have reported a white mist filling the box on the anniversary of her death, and other strange happenings. But if you're ever in Rose Hill, I really encourage you to, if you're exploring the cemetery, to visit this monument. It's also huge. This picture doesn't do it justice, but when I was standing in front of it, it's amazing how big it is and how detailed it is. And it really is something. It's a great example of how these there's these beautiful works of art kind of tucked away in these cemeteries all over the city. So finally, we arrive at our last stop for the night, so you can catch your breath, or I can catch mine, I suppose. So full disclosure, Graceland is my favorite cemetery that I've been to. I've probably been to about 36 different cemeteries for various projects and research, and Graceland is really incredible. It's just an awesome place. It was established in 1860, and it is a Victorian era cemetery, a lot like Rose Hill. And what I mean by that is prior to the Victorian era, so like prior to, let's say the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s, cemeteries were often really dank and dark places. They weren't well taken care of. You didn't necessarily want to go visit if you had family buried there. But during the Victorian era, that changed very much. And they started to look like parks, right? And people were taking care of them, and trees were planted, and ponds were dug, and things like that. So there was a big shift during that time period. So Graceland itself is about 119 acres, so it's about half the size of Rose Hill. But because those two cemeteries opened within a year of each other, they're considered sister cemeteries. And as I said, it's an amazing place to walk around. There's so much Chicago and local history in this place. The first one I wanted to show you is a statue, and its name is Eternal Silence. It's a bronze sculpture that was finished in 1909 and is ironically part of a grave for a man named Dexter Graves. This is on the National Register of Historic Places, and there's a very particular legend associated with this statue that I wanted to share with you. And that's, if you look into the statue's eyes, that you will see a vision of your own death. So maybe some of you looked away, that you didn't want to see that. But regardless, it actually looks a little more ominous than it did. The bronze color of the statue is now green. So you have that stark black marble background. And it is, when you're there in person looking at it, it is a bit creepy, I do have to admit. This next grave is for John Kinsey, and he was among the first white settlers in Chicago. And aside from that distinction, he just had, when I was doing research on him, I found all of these like wild stories that he was connected to. So I just wanted to share a few with you too. So he was born in Quebec and later came to Detroit as a fur trader. And in 1785, he helped rescue 2 kidnapped women from the Shawnee tribe, one of whom later married him. Well, aside from that, and then in June of 1812, he was involved in an altercation with a man named Jean Lalime, and he unfortunately killed him. Now, John claimed it was in self-defense, but some historians will point to this as the first murder in Chicago. So that's another event he's kind of associated with. So in August of that year, he happened to be in Fort Dearborn, which is a name that probably rings familiar for you, and when it was attacked by the Potawatomi Indians. Now, he escaped with his family from that, fled back to Detroit, but the next year he was accused of treason by the British. He was put on a transport ship back to Britain, but he managed to escape and eventually fled back to America, where he decided to identify as an American instead of British. And I don't blame him after that. But he passed away in 1828 while living in Chicago. And as I said, even though I think most people would recognize him as like, oh, he was one of the first white settlers in Chicago, when I dug a little bit into his life, he's connected to all these wild stories. And it's just amazing to share that stuff. This grave is for Jack Johnson. He was the first African-American to hold the world heavyweight boxing title. Of course, he faced a tremendous amount of racism during his career. He married 3 women, all of whom were white, which caused huge controversy at that time. But he was known to be extremely arrogant and headstrong. And there's a great story I want to share with you. It's another one where it's like, well, I don't know if this is real or not, but I'll share it with you anyway. That one time he was speeding, he was pulled over by a police officer and fined $50. And he handed the police officer a $100 bill. And when the police officer said, why did you hand me a $100 bill? Jack said, because I'm going to be speeding on the way back too. So whether that story is true or not, I think it tells us a lot about his personality, or at least what people thought about him. So he was known to be a very patient fighter in the ring as well. He would actually play with his opponents and carry on conversations with spectators while the bout was occurring. And after fighting 114 different bouts and winning 80 of them, he finally retired when he was in his 60s. I can't imagine fighting that long, but he was an incredible guy. This very impressive grave is for George Pullman, and it is enormous. You probably get a sense of that from the photo, but it is amazing when you're looking at it in person. Now, he designed the Pullman sleeping car and built the working town of Pullman, some of which still exists today. And as I said, his monument is massive, but his sleeping car gained national attention when it was used to transport Abraham Lincoln after the assassination. So in the years after that, his company grew tremendously, particularly as it got later in the 19th century. And as interesting as his life is and his accomplishments, the story I wanted to share about how he was buried, because it's so wild. So in 1894, there was a strike in his company town, and it was a terrible event. It was suppressed by troops. There was a lot of injuries. It was awful, to say the least. And when he died 3 years later, his family was terrified that the workers, who were still probably rightfully furious with him, were going to desecrate his grave. So the family arranged for his body to be placed and buried a very particular way. And this is what I want to share with you. So first, he was put in a lead-lined mahogany coffin, which was then sealed inside a block of concrete. Okay, that's step one, right? Now, at the cemetery, a large pit had been dug, and its base and walls were made of 18 inches of reinforced concrete. So when the coffin was lowered into the pit, it was covered with asphalt and tar paper. More concrete was then poured on top of that, along with steel rails that were bolted together at right angles. And finally, another layer of concrete on top of that. The entire burial process took 2 days to complete. And it sounds crazy, but this is what occurred. And as I was researching this, and coming across this information, one of the thoughts I had was like, one day after I pass away, if I have to be buried under 18 inches of reinforced concrete, I probably made some poor life choices or really made some people mad. So George Pullman, for better or worse, made a lot of people angry, but that is how he was buried. Pretty incredible. So buried in a slightly more normal fashion, I suppose, is Daniel Burnham. Of course, he was a famous American architect, and his grave actually rests on a small island with his family in the cemetery. And although Burnham is known all over the world for his architectural designs, for instance, he designed quite a few buildings in the Philippines, he is probably best remembered for working on the 1893 World's Fair and developing an urban plan for Chicago. And for those of you who have read Devil in the White City, which is a great book, I recommend it. It describes a lot of what it would have been like to be at the fair. And you can see the picture on the bottom showing a portion of it. So this was a massive undertaking by Burnham and his associates. It was about 600 acres in what was then a desolate Jackson Park. And it featured around 200 structures, most of which were temporary. And this was such a huge undertaking. The night before the fair opened, they were literally putting the finishing touches on it. They were working up until the last possible second. That's how big of a project this was. So as for the Burnham plan for Chicago, he died in 1912, really before any of it could be implemented. However, elements of the plan were later completed, things like the expansion of the park system, development of the lakefront, things such as that. And it does absolutely continue to influence Chicago's development to this day, more than a century after he died. This grave is Marshall Field. It's a little more subdued than his contemporaries. If you can call a large statue subdued, it's pretty amazing. But the name of the statue is Memory, and it was designed by Daniel Chester French and Henry Bacon, who later went on to design the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. So they have quite the pedigree there. Of course, he was one of the founders of Marshall Field's department store. Some of the things he was known for is instituting unconditional refunds, consistent pricing, which was not necessarily in stores before this time. He's also attributed with the phrases, "give the lady what she wants," and "the customer is always right," although historians aren't actually sure if he said those or not, but those are often attributed to him. And although the Field Museum is named in his honor, he was initially reluctant to fund them. He is quoted as saying, quote, "I don't know anything about a museum, and I don't care to know anything about a museum. I am not going to give you $1 million. Well, the joke was ultimately on him. He did eventually relent and ended up giving the museum $8 million after he passed away in 1906. So that worked out for the Field quite well. And at one time, he was the richest person in Chicago. This next grave is Alan Pinkerton, and some of you may be familiar with him. He was a famous detective and a founder of the Pinkerton Agency. And his agents served the Union Army during the Civil War by collecting intelligence. They foiled an 1861 assassination plot against Lincoln and Baltimore. He was an interesting guy, but I wanted to focus on one of his agents, Kate Warren. So Warren is believed to be the first woman detective in America. The photo on the right there may be her. You can see that red arrow pointing down, but historians aren't 100% sure. She was hired by Pinkerton and proved to be just a natural at her job. She was one of several agents to help undercover a plot against Lincoln in 1861, as I mentioned. She would go undercover as a Southern belle to gather information about Confederate defenses. And she was later part of General McClellan's security detail and helped break a Confederate spy ring in Washington, D.C. So she turned out to be one of Alan Pinkerton's best agents. And she died in 1867 after falling ill. And considering the difficult situation that many women would have faced in 19th century America, late 19th century America, her story is really, truly amazing and unique. And it's something that I wanted to point out is pretty cool. So the final grave I wanted to touch on tonight is that of Inez Briggs. And she died in 1880 when she was about 7 years old. This is an instance when you're doing research on some of these individuals, it's really hard to separate sort of fact and fiction and history from mythology because it's so tightly intertwined. But there are many, many stories surrounding this particular grave. There are reports that the statue has disappeared during thunderstorms. Some people have reported seeing a small child wandering the cemetery at night after closing hours. And there's other stories I came across that said it's actually a different child buried here altogether. So it really is hard. There's so many facets to it to figure out what is fact and what is fiction. But even today, people will go to this grave and leave small toys and stuffed animals as kind of a tribute to her. So it's kind of cool and touching to see that. But as I said, it's a great example of how these legends arise and kind of help cloud the truth. But at the same time, it provides a different aspect to the story. And it's that mix of history and mythology is what's so interesting about cemeteries and about local history. And I really do encourage you to visit these places. There's so many of them, and they're just filled with so many cool stories and so much history of Chicago and the surrounding suburbs. And there's just so much to learn. And I had a great time researching them. I hope to continue to do more of these programs in the future because I want to keep finding out what's out there. And seeing, what kinds of things I can get from these places. So thank you so much for attending my program tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. I really appreciate it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here in just a second, and we'll see if you guys have any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. If anyone has a question they want to pop in the chat real quick, I'll wait just a minute or so. Otherwise, thank you all again for coming out tonight, and thank you, Kevin, for all that awesome information. I have to tell you, Kevin, while we're waiting for any questions, I did go to, what is the one? I'm like totally like Mount Carmel Cemetery to see that.
Oh, you did?
Well, I went to all of them at one time, and my friend and I, Eileen Kennedy, just wanted to say thank you, Kevin. Tons of great info about cemeteries so close to home. Thank you, Eileen.
Thank you.
No question, but want to commend you on an excellent program. We really enjoyed it. Thank you. Oh, Rita Dobbs, thanks. Nice reviews. Which is the best cemetery? Oh, you liked Graceland the best, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's like I said, I've been to probably 36 different cemeteries from the north side to the south side, and there's just something about Graceland that is just it's a beautiful place, and it's so historic. And there's these figures that are so big in Chicago history, and they're all just buried in the same place. It's really cool.
That's cool. And then Jill Johnson asked, any stories on Resurrection Mary you came across?
Yeah, so I actually have a second part to this program in which I talk about Resurrection Cemetery. Yeah, I couldn't fit everything that I wanted to in the first part, so I actually have an entire second part in which I delve into Resurrection. Yep.
Okay. Jeanette, will this be posted anywhere? So much info and nice to be seeing again. Great job. Thanks. Yes, Natalie is recording it for us tonight. So we do have a Oaklawn Library YouTube page if you search on YouTube. So we will post it there, and that way it can kind of be there if anyone also didn't make it tonight that might want to see it as well. Eileen Kennedy wants to know, when is the second part?
That's up to you, Melissa.
Evan, are you interested in doing part 2? Well, we don't have that scheduled yet, but if there is interest, we could definitely schedule it and, update our information. If you're not subscribed to our e-newsletter, make sure to subscribe to that. We send out a monthly e-newsletter, and check our website and social media. We try to put most of the programs in our newsletter, but with things being virtually, sometimes things come up that we want to add. So it's great if you kind of keep an eye on all of those other resources to know what's going on at the library. But yeah, we could definitely do the second part. We just don't have that scheduled as of right now. Helen, do you know when it stopped becoming the norm to make massive headstones like the ones you showed? I know it not, yeah.
So I mean, I can't give you an exact date on that, but no, you're absolutely right. Like if you go to a more, quote unquote, modern cemetery, like Woodlawn is an example that I can think of, that newer cemeteries tend to be very flat, where there's not, those giant headstones everywhere. And I think that's a mix of the cemetery sort of putting in more restrictions, and also just the sheer cost of those things being unavailable for most people. But you're right, when you go to older cemeteries, it's such a different experience, and there's so much more kind of to look at and more that's visible. Yeah.
Okay. And Mary Williams says, I'm going to Graceland soon. Wonderful.
Good.
Take lots of pics, Mary. Okay,
Yes.
we got maybe time if anyone has like one more question to shoot in the chat. Otherwise, we will wrap it up for tonight. And like I said, if we can try to get part 2 scheduled in the winter maybe and keep you
Yeah.
all updated on that. So,
Yeah, that would be great.
all right, well, thank you all again and have a wonderful evening and happy, safe Halloween. And good night.
All right. Thank you, guys. Have a good evening.